Actually, that's coming off. Let me fix that for you. Oops, hold on a second. Let me readjust that. Okay, this looks a lot better. Right there. Right? Yeah, looks good.
Okay, thank you. No, schiena di guarda, perché questo è il conto. The mic doesn't work?
I think so, yeah.
Ah, okay. We're
Right,
ready.
so I want to start thanking the organizers for inviting me to...
Use the mic.
You turn it off, the mic. There's a button that you have.
I failed already.
Otherwise, they don't hear us in the galaxy.
How about now? Yeah. That's better. So again, I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to present here, despite the somewhat preliminary nature of the project at the time of the invitation. And it's a little bit less preliminary now, but it's still quite preliminary. And I have to say it's a bit cruel, though, to pair me up with Jean-Noël, though, because it's, his beautifully completed paper, which happens to be forthcoming in the QJE. So it's what I'm going to show, it's probably going to look even more preliminary than it is. And I should say, of course, that this is joint work with Alonso, who's sitting there. He's a graduate student at Harvard and an integral part of this project, actually. So let me begin by trying to frame the broad topic of the paper. So this is a paper on sequential global value chain. So there's this idea that if you think about modern manufacturing production processes, they all have some element of sequentiality. If you think about the beginning, you start with raw materials that are turned into basic components that are then turned into more complex components. And assembly, my favorite example is if you think about the production of semiconductors, you'd start with the raw materials that be largely silicon. Silicon is then purified. It's then turned into cylinders, the ingots that are then cut into wafers, and then there's this process where the transistors are inscribed into the wafers, the connectors are put, and then there's a process of breaking it up into dices, packaging, testing, and so on. So this is an example of a sequential production process, and what's interesting and why some of us are particularly interested in global value chains is because this is a phenomenon that is now happening worldwide. You could imagine sort of a long assembly line where all these sequential processes were done within a given factory, and what you now have in the world is a world in which silicon is coming from a bunch of places on Earth. I hope you can see the maps. And then it's sort of sent to places where it's purified, largely in Germany. You'd think, well, this is where these ingots are produced, and maybe that's where we're going to do the wafers, but no, wafer fabrication is actually happening in other parts of the world, so in the US, but also in Israel, Ireland, and some spots in Asia. You'd say, okay, this is where the wafers fabricated. You'd imagine that's where it's going to be assembled, but not quite, because chip assembly is actually happening in other locations, largely in Asia, from which the chips are finally, once assembled, they're going to be shipped to, say, this is laptop producers, but a bunch of electronic producers. So this is a world where you have this sequentiality that is now happening across borders. Now you might say, cool pictures, but why do we care? I mean, what does it matter that production processes are sequential? And coming from a theoretical perspective, I guess our interest in trying to understand the implications of this sequentiality for the workings of general equilibrium models. You might say, is this all about comparative advantage? You just do stuff where traditional neoclassical theories tell you production should happen. Is there something new coming from that? Maybe from a more empirical perspective, you might be interested in understanding whether, if you look at aggregate, from a macro perspective, you're looking at aggregate trade patterns and you're trying to predict the effects of certain trade agreements, say TTIP, does it matter that this is how this production is happening, that there's this element of sequentiality? Does it change the predictions that come out of this frameworks? So obviously, we're going to try to shed some light on these issues in the paper. We're not the first to do that. There's a literature thinking about the role of sequentiality for location. More recently, the work by Baldwin and Venables has been getting a lot of attention. Work by Costino and co-authors. There's been work, and we're going to hear a paper later today on the effect of sequentiality on organizational choices. So there's a body of work there. There's also some people that have trying to, a beautiful paper by Russ with Thibaut Fally, a work by Johnson and co-authors, trying to get at the quantitative effects of these models. But we'll argue that on the one hand, this theoretical work has ignored an aspect that we think is central in understanding the location of sequential value chains, namely, these are models without trait frictions, and models that have tried to go to the data and take into account those trait frictions. These are very parsimonious models. They're very low-dimensional models. Okay, so what we're going to try to kind of contribute to this literature by kind of pushing both of these agendas. So why do we emphasize trait frictions? Well, because we know that they exist and they matter. Let me try to give you a sense of why maybe previous works on this topic kind of ignored the existence of these trait frictions or modeled them in very, very simple ways. So for that, just imagine, think about the problem of a global sourcing problem where you're trying to decide on the optimal location of production of different stages in a sequential value chain. If you don't have trait frictions, then at the end of the day, it's not much more than trying to figure out each input that you need, what is going to be the least cost source for that input. Okay, so in a multi-country environment, for those that have seen my work with Teresa Ford and Felix Tintelnot, that would be one way to approach this. Now, the moment that you have sequentiality and trait frictions, matters are going to become much trickier. And the reason for that is because the location of a stage in the value chain is not going to be independent of where you're locating other stages. That is, maybe you think that tire production is going to be more cheaply produced in a location, but you have to have some knowledge of where rubber, for instance, is coming from in order to decide exactly where each stage should be produced. So you care about where the semi-finished product is coming from. You also care where it's going to. Okay, and this is something that, in the absence of trait frictions, you obviously do not need to worry about. So when framed this way, some of you that might have seen some work in the logistics literature, there's a connection between this problem and the famous traveling salesman problem in OR. Okay, and we know that this is a complicated problem. It's NP complex. As the dimensionality, in a world with many locations, is a problem that's going to quickly, it's going to blow up in your face. So what we're going to try to do in this paper is to develop some insights that comes out of this problem, and to try to devise techniques to actually be able to tackle this problem in more realistic environments. Now, I should say this is a paper about the role of geography of trait frictions and the location of sequential value chains. This is not a paper on trade policy, but we view this as sort of a first step in trying to understand how man-made trait frictions would affect the geography of production. So I'm not going to say much about trade agreements, but when we go to the quantitative part of the paper, you'll see that with some work, this could be turned into something that might be able to shed light on actual trade policies. Okay, so more precisely what the contributions of the paper are, I'm going to start on the theory side. I'm just going to develop a kind of very general framework of global value chains in which we're going to have a general geography of trade costs across countries. Then I'm going to get something out of the model. I'm going to highlight a qualitative prediction that came out of the model that I don't think we walked into the project with a certainty that that's what we're going to find. So it's something we learned from the model, which is there's good reasons why there should be a centrality-downstreamness nexus in the data. Other things equal, relatively more central locations are locations where you want to have the relatively most downstream stages of production. Okay, and remote locations might be part of value chains, but it's more likely that they're going to specialize in upstream stages. And this has nothing to do with natural resources or anything like that. Leaving all that stuff out, you'd also expect more remote locations to be higher up the value chain. Now this is we're going to go back to Factory Asia over and over during the presentation, but it's something that actually is surprisingly consistent with the data. If you look at a bunch, 11 largest Southeast and Southeast Asian countries, you're going to notice that there's a very clear positive correlation between the remoteness of these countries in terms of the log GDP weighted distance to other countries in the world and the average position of countries in the value chain. And this is coming from basically taking the measure of upstreamness that Thibault developed with Russ and that David and I developed as well, and filtering it through an export vector so you get a sense of whether exports of different countries are relatively higher or lower down the value chain. And what you find is that within Factory Asia, Indonesia is the most remote country, and it is also the country that happens to be more upstream, whereas China is the most downstream country and happens to be also the country that is more central relative to the rest of the world economy. And in the middle, things line up amazingly well. Now we could have discussion about why is this so? Is Indonesia doing, we can all rationalize each of these data points maybe, but I'm going to give you a very, very sparse explanation for why at least part of that correlation might be driven by centrality, okay?
So maybe you're going to say more about this. The downstreamness of China, is it due to consumption in the US or due to labor-intensive assembly in China?
Okay, so I'll get to that. So it's nothing to do with labor intensity, but obviously the part of the story is going to be related to the fact that relatively more central locations are good locations to assemble and distribute goods. But it's going to be a little bit more subtle than that. Okay, but no, exactly. I mean, you would say assembly is labor intensive, China has low wages. We're not going to fit that into the model, and yet we're going to be able to kind of.
Paul, maybe it's going to be 0.3. No, it's not there. So the man-made part,
it's not here.
It's not there. It's all about geography so far, which is not man-made. In terms of like the frictions, it's not going to be.
No, that's why the paper is on the geography.
I thought you said in the previous slide that you're going to focus on the man-made. You're not.
No, if I said that, I'm going to let you down, yes.
Paper on the man-made. No, but at least it's not.
Do I still get to go on, or?
Yeah.
Just to be clear, though, the geography, as you define it, is time invariant, and so downstreamness may or may not be.
Sure.
At the country level. So whatever's causing those guys to change places is something.
Absolutely. But, I take your point, but obviously the taus I'm going to have in the model, I'm going to map them to geography. I totally understand and agree that they're partly driven by other factors that are time invariant, and we might want to understand exactly where those are coming from and understand why they might vary. And I'm totally on board. It's just one extra layer, and I think it's okay to just, that's how we do work, right? We start, positive models of trade that have some trade frictions, and then we build on those to think about optimal policy. So I don't think it's fair to ask me to do everything in one.
The geography that you showed is actually not completely fixed over time. Yeah, so
fair enough.
No,
but,
so what might be driving?
At the end of the day, however, I'll give part of what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this is completely ad hoc. I don't know why I should use this measure of centrality. I'm going to give you a model-based measure of centrality and show you that it equally correlates well with the data, and that is going to be a time invariant one. So that's before Andy says that later. Let me just preempt that. Okay, so that's part one, and that's going to be, we're going to have to work quite hard to get to this result, in that we're going to simplify things a lot, to the point where some of you might say, I don't recognize the world anymore. It's just too abstract. So we're going to step back also, and this is where I think the next few months are going to keep us quite busy, which is trying to move away from this super simple variant of the model to environments that are richer, much higher dimensional, but where we can still use linear programming techniques to understand the optimal patterns of production in the world. And that, I think, is interesting, because this is where we want to push this, and I'll give you a flavor of this, where we can try to use the model to shed lights on this transition from what we call global value chains, but are really regional value chains, to a world in which as trade frictions decrease, maybe we're going to move to really more global value chain. So trying to use the model to understand what would it take for global value chains to move to Africa and to other continents or other areas in the world where they're not really there. Okay. Now, for that, it sort of connects with the third branch of the project. And I don't know whether this is going to be one paper or two. I don't know how we're going to do this, but I'm going to give you a flavor of where we stand on that third branch of the paper, which is to give up altogether on a sort of model of the deterministic movement of goods along value chains and adopt this sort of Eaton and Cordham approach, which is more about trying to understand on average where we expect countries to be in value chains and use that to kind of look at the data in a more sort of structural way and use the structure of the model to perform counterfactuals. And I'll try to, if I have time, I'll try to explain why Rob Johnson and Ross and other people that have done this, they've been sort of forced to work with low-dimensional environments, like 2 stages and things like that, even adopting the Eaton and Cordham approach. So Eaton and Cordham is not one you can just take to any number of stages. But I'll show you where we have a trick that is going to allow us to actually do it for an arbitrary number of stages. And yet, we're not there yet, but we believe we can calibrate the model with world input-output tables in a very parsimonious way. Okay, so this is the roadmap, what I want to tell you about, which is I want to walk you first through a general formulation of the problem. We've been debating whether that's a good idea or not. It's going to be pretty heavy, but I think it's important to understand what we're trying to model at a broad sense. Then we're going to narrow it and give you a specific case. We're going to rely on a proximity concentration trade-off to have some gains to global, so basically spreading out value chains across countries. And within that proximity concentration variant of the model, we're going to look at factoriation. We're going to compare what comes out of the model relative to what we see in the data. Okay, then I'm going to give you a flavor of how you can start relaxing this and making it a little bit more realistic. And the last few minutes, I'll dive into the Ricardian model. And I should say, this and this are, all these are going to be specific, special cases of this general formulation that I'll start with. Okay. So what's this general environment? We're going to think about a world with J countries, where you have some consumers that are deriving utility from consuming a bunch of final good varieties. And what's new here, I guess, is that these consumer goods are produced combining a series of stages that need to be performed in a sequential manner. Okay, so there's an engineering constraints that makes these production processes be sequential. For simplicity, we're going to think about a world with only one factor of production, labor. Okay, so the question is what's going to generate comparative advantage? You can have Ricardian comparative advantage. We're going to get there. To begin with, we're going to have a much simpler story of comparative advantage that will have to do with agglomeration economies. The last stage of production is indexed by N, and we're going to often refer to it as assembly. So you're going through the stages, and this very last stage is assembly. And countries are going to differ both in their labor force, in terms of some efficiency units of labor that they're endowed with, as well as their geography, which here is a time-invariant matrix of bilateral trade costs between any two countries, I and J. Okay? So that's basically the model. There's not more than that in its most general form. So some notation that I'm going to come back to in the next few minutes. So you can denote consumption of the final good variety Z. Remember, there's a bunch of varieties. I'm going to index them by Z. Final consumption of variety Z in country I, I'm going to denote by Ci and Z. At the cost of maybe create confusion, I'm also going to denote Ci little n of Z, the quantity of intermediate good Z completed up to stage n less than n, that is available in country I. Okay, so maybe you get some final good consumption that is assembled good, but you can also denote C, the consumption of intermediate inputs in a given country. LINZ is going to be labor, the allocation of labor, of a country's labor share to the production of stage N of good Z. Okay, so there's a bunch of goods, and then there's some allocation of labor of a country to a given stage. combining whatever intermediate inputs up to the previous stage and the amount of labor you have in production, you're going to have some production of stage N output, and I'm going to denote that by YINZ, where Z is the final good, I is the country of production, N is the stage. Okay, so Y is going to be produced with L and CIN minus 1 of Z. Okay, I'll put the production function in a second. And finally, there's going to be, once you have production, the model is going to have to tell you how your production is split across the world. Now that I've produced in any given stage, where is that going to? Is it going to just one country? If it's going to more than one country, what share of that output is going to different countries, J? Okay? So with that note, before I set up the problem, let me just give you a graphical illustration. There could be many, many production stages, but take 2 stages N and N plus 1. What we're saying is there's some intermediate input up to stage N minus 1 that enters a given country, and we're denoting this by CAN minus 1 as CBN minus 1. It's combined with labor, and that produces some output that then is distributed either to just one country, here delta BCN would be 1, or it might be split into 2, in which case you need to figure out where that split is. Okay? And especially, this is a general case, but maybe this could be assembly, okay? And then you need to figure out where the assembled good is going to and who gets how much of what. Okay, so the general problem, which we can, it's simpler to kind of describe it in terms of a Planner's problem rather than specify market structure, would be one in which you're looking for the set of Pareto optimal allocations, which are no other thing than the allocation of labor for each stage in each country and each good, and this distribution of shares. And the Pareto optimal ones are ones that are going to maximize some weighted sum of world welfare, where lambda i's are just some Pareto weight assigned to any given country I. This is the population of country I, and this is the utility that individuals get from their per capita consumption of all these varieties. And this is a constraint problem in that, on the one hand, how much consumption of intermediate good completed up to stage N you get in a given country is a function of where that output is produced and how much of the output of wherever is produced comes to your country, discounted by this iceberg trade cost. Okay, so this is basically saying how much of stage 1 I have, how much of stage N assembly I get is a function of where it's produced, how much of that production I get, and how costly it is to get it to my country. It's also constrained by whatever defines output, which is this general production function of LIN and CI and minus 1Z, which is the general production function that I'll put more structure on. You need all the requirements. Obviously, these deltas have to add up to 1. In this example before, these 2 objects need to add up to 1. Okay, so that's another constraint. And then finally, there's labor market clearing, which is that in every country I, labor supply has to equate the total usage of labor across goods and across stages. Okay? Yes?
Theoretically trivial question, but people who use input-output tables realize that goods are often both intermediate inputs and final goods. Mm-hmm. So does your model deal with the fact that some of the stuff are going to be sold directly to final good consumers, or there's only one final good and like all the other?
Yeah, no. This is not where I mean I think of it as a sort of maybe conveniently, but I think about a failure of the way that we compute the statistics, right? So you're saying when you map this to the data, be a bit careful because there's always for any industry there's going to be some sales to final consumers. So that's something we're going to have to think down the line when we go to there. We're not going to have that here. There's like this sequence, and the only consumer of any stage N good is a following. Now, obviously, if you take this model and you put it into a coarser industry classification, I'm going to replicate what we see in the data, but just as a failure of the way that we code the data. Okay. Yes.
So why are we looking at the Planner's problem here? Is that because you're looking for some efficient market equilibrium? Or?
Yeah, so the reason why I'm doing this here is because the simplest way to illustrate this downstreamness centrality nexus is in a model in which you don't have any other source of comparative advantage. Okay, and we needed, in the model, we needed something to create a gain to doing stuff abroad. Okay, and agglomeration economies was the simplest way to do it. But then we know that if I look at the market equilibrium here, there's going to be multiple equilibria and things like that. So this seemed like the easiest way. I mean, it's going to raise the obvious issue of how can you then get stuff out of this and claim victory looking at the data. Okay, so you can ask that question later, but it's an obvious limitation of this. Okay, but I'll show you that actually when we do the Eaton-Cordham stuff where we can just look at the competitive equilibrium, we're going to get a very similar result in a much more complicated model.
Paul?
Yes.
So are you going to have the wage equality across different countries?
No.
No. Okay.
I'm not going to look at wages. So that's
Right.
another sort of related to this. I'm just looking at the unallocation of labor, but I'm pretty sure that the implied things that are going to come out of the model are, at some level, it's going to be a function of the Pareto weights, because if you think about the wages related to aggregate income, the aggregate income of different countries is going to be a function of the lambdas.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is very complicated. You might say, why is he doing all this stuff? Well, I mean, I want to show you that I'm going to go different ways from now on, but they're all going to be part of this general problem. Okay, and I'm going to start with a sort of a very stark simplification of the problem. So here's how I'm going to start with it. First, I'm going to become a macroeconomist and say there's only one final good. Okay, sorry, Fabio. And then I'm going to say that these gains from specialization are purely driven by an external economy, which basically says that the productivity, so this is a production function that is Cobb-Douglas in intermediate inputs up to the previous stage and labor. Okay, there's constant returns to scale here, but there's this additional term that's going to generate an incentive to concentrate the production of an input of a stage in a given country. Okay, the more you do of a stage in a country, the more efficient you're going to be. So the higher is phi, the higher is going to be the gain relative to autarky, in which we're producing all the stages. The higher is phi, the higher is going to be the gain from fragmentation. And I'm also going to make our life easy. We're going to make our life easy by assuming that GVCs are what I'm going to call pure snakes, following Benevels and Baldwin and Benevels. Okay, so there's no merging and no splitting. Basically, every good comes from one source and goes to just one. Okay, when we can relax that later, but this is for now. It's basically going to make matters simpler, because essentially all these deltas, they're all going to be 0 or 1, except for assembly. When we have an assembled good, we allow the good to be, there could be only one assembly location that then is shipping the final good everywhere, but at every prior stage, delta is either 0 or 1. Okay? Yes?
Every country only does one thing.
I'll get to that. I'm going to get to that. So at the beginning, I will impose that. Okay? But for that, I'm going to have to make an additional assumption. But before we make that assumption, just with these three assumptions, we can solve, because of this deltas being 0, 1, we can solve for the consumption of the final good. Remember, there's only one good here. Consumption of the final good in country I is a function of this delta N, Li, and I, which is the share of the production of the good that is flowing in the value chain that is leading to consumption in I, that accrues to I, and then it's a function of the trade costs of all the path that leads to the assembly location from which country I is buying. Okay, and that's why you have all the taus here. And then there's a term that reflects the economies of scale, that basically a function of the allocation of labor of the countries that are part of this value chain that is servicing I across all the stages. Now, what I put this in red is to notice the following, which is this is going to be a function of all this trade costs, but it's not a symmetric function of the trade costs. The further downstream you get, the higher is the exponent on the trade costs. Okay, so yes, trade costs are reducing consumption, but trade costs that are happening relatively down the value chain, assembly in particular, but anything that is close to assembly, carries a higher weight. Okay, and the reason for this is we have iceberg trade costs here, which I think is realistic. Those are proportional to the gross value of a product. That's how we have tariffs, but also most freight costs, insurance is going to be proportional to gross output. So as the value of the good grows along the value chain, it is becoming increasingly costly to incur trade costs. Okay, so remoteness, high trade costs are more and more costly as you move down the value chain. And for assembly, it's particularly relevant, because that's when the good is most valuable. Now let's get to Andy's point. So let's make it even more restrictive, so we can actually say something beyond this and turn this into some sort of proposition that illustrates this. So I'm going to focus in a second in this what we call the even case, in which there's the same number of stages as countries, and we look at an injective assignment, a one-to-one assignment where each stage is produced in each country. Okay, so now I'm at a point in the presentation where as I anticipated, some of you are thinking, what does that have to do with the world? Okay, I've reduced the world to a single value chain that has n stages, the same as the number of countries, and each country does one stage. Okay, so we're going to have to relax this, but that's a problem that we can actually say something about. Okay, so in this even case, and you assume log utility, we could probably relax this, but in this case it's particularly simple. We can show that the optimal assignment of stages to countries is going to solve this very simple function of the bilateral trade costs between the countries that are in this value chain. So all countries are in this global value chain, and you're ranking them, you're sort of sequencing in a way that is going to minimize this function. Now, this might seem simple, but in order to figure out what is the assignment that minimizes this, in principle, you'd have to look at the compute this for n factorial combinations and then figure out which one is the cost minimizing one. And this is something that's going to explode very quickly. Some of you that might have seen this is what we call this a modified traveling salesman problem. The traveling salesman problem is this problem of that people in FedEx and these companies have to solve all the time, which is they need to deliver a set of packages and they need to find the optimal route to do that in a way that's minimizing overall cost. So here it's not exactly a minimization of the sum of trade costs. There's this additional aspect, which is you are putting a higher and higher weight on cost minimization as you move down the value chain. Okay, it is as if this traveling salesman is getting increasingly tired, and it's more and more painful for him to deliver. So you want to make sure he doesn't have to walk a lot as he is finishing his deliveries. Okay, and you see that in terms of this weights here. On top of that, assembly is also going to be shaped by population and the Pareto weights, in that you want to be, the final stages, you want them to be close to where demand is. So if you have a big country, think about China, maybe assembly, you want it to be close to China because that's where demand is. Or if the social planner cares about some countries more than others, it might want to also move assembly close to the countries they care about. But conditional on assembly, this is also showing you that the rest of the value chain is not going to be, it's going to be immune to these factors. Okay, so
I got confused. So in this even case, simple case, you have production only in one, like assembly, it's only in one.
Yes.
And then everyone consumes around the world.
Yes.
So also one reason why tau becomes more important as you move along is that I guess you have to, at the end, you have to distribute to everywhere. So
yes,
you're paying all these costs to every single consumer. Okay.
Correct.
Because you were
that's the end.
Hinting at the, yeah.
So that's the n.
Two reasons. Yeah,
so you're going n, and that's why you put a power, like this is a power of n, but it's all in log form. And here it's a little bit low, like n over n. Okay. So it's growing linearly as you go down the value chain. So what I'm going to show you in a sec is I'm actually going to try to put some numbers here and try to see for Factory Asia actually what is the optimal, in this hypothetical world in which there's the same number of stages as countries, how would you want this hypothetical value chain to flow? Before that, let me just turn this into this intuitive notion that that centrality is particularly important downstream, to turn it into a proposition. And for that, I could either do this and say this is our measure of centrality, okay, so whatever's, you can turn this into a measure of centrality, or I can illustrate it this way, which is if I assume that trade costs can be decomposed as follows. So they're sort of log separable. So there's a component of the origin and destination. Then, and basically notice that a high rho is a sort of a measure of centrality. If I'm a central country, there should be low trade frictions of me vis-a-vis any other country. Okay, so there's one way to decompose trade costs. We know it's probably counterfactual, but this is just to kind of illustrate this. Then you can basically show that relatively more central locations, countries with high rho, are going to be downstream relative to more remote countries, which are countries that no matter who you're looking, which other country you look at, they tend to have associated high trade costs. Okay, so that's this centrality-downstreamness nexus. So that's sort of a way to formalize this insight that you expect more central locations to be downstream, but you might say, well, if we know that trade costs are not log separable, if they were, gravity equations would be in big trouble. So let's relax that and let's actually look at the modified TSP.
Yeah, Russell, you had a question. You have to come to the mic, sorry, because we have been told. Oh, very good.
I'm a little just wondering this traveling salesman problem. I'm just wondering if you're overdoing it or if I'm missing why it's important. So if we went back to the optimization problem, the only constraint that's not linear is your production function. So if it was Leontief, all of those constraints would be linear. In which case there should be a unique global optimum. Yeah. And it shouldn't be too hard to solve.
Well, that's where I'm going. It's not going to be too hard. I mean, so in this particular case, if we were to do it brute force, there's like millions and millions of possibilities. You're saying it's a linear programming problem, so I can use some sort of algorithms and do that in finite time. And indeed, even for this 12 case, how long does it take? 1 second? So you can do that. In this particular case, it's going to be very simple. When you look at the higher dimensional cases, it's much less clear that that's the case. And that's the same reason why there's still people in OR trying to think about the traveling salesman problem and trying to devise algorithms to get arbitrarily close to the right solution in finite time. I mean, this is not a problem you can easily...
But if you just have the iceberg trade costs, it's still everything's linear, right? So, and it's just multiplicative in terms of the
Sure, but you can turn the TSP into a linear programming problem. The issue is that when the dimensions...
But the TSP, you can't find an optimum, right? I mean, that there are sort of...
Of course you can find an optimum. What do you mean?
So the OR guys have trouble finding optima of these problems under certain conditions. But under that problem, at least, you've got linear constraints everywhere. I don't think it's hard to solve, I guess.
But
the more general case is not linear.
Okay.
But it should be written in a way that's linear because you find this problem. It's really, really high dimensional. We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
But you also, I mean, what I'm missing is you can take the TSP and you write it as a linear programming, as exactly a linear programming problem. So if those guys are struggling, it has to mean that it's not sufficient to say I can just have linear constraints and I'm done.
Well, let me see what you're doing, but I guess the sort of setup of the problem seems relatively easy to solve, right? I mean, I guess you can do it in a fraction of a second, but so yeah.
Okay, so we'll let's get to that. So in this case, indeed, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's basically. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at this factory Asia example where we're going to set all the Pareto weights to 1, and we're going to look at the 11 largest East and Southeast Asian countries. The taus, we're going to back out. I think this is pretty standard. We're going to back them out from gravity equation estimates. So we've looked at sort of obviously distance, but common border, common language, a bunch of variables to kind of have some estimates of tau ij. These are very crude. I mean, there's, looking at what comes out of it, it's obvious that we're under-predicting trade frictions in some African countries and so on. That's in part why we're focusing on this as factory Asia example. And again, you could do this brute force, but this would take a while. We started there. It took a few minutes. But yes, linear programming is definitely very helpful. You can do this in like an instant. Okay. So this is what comes out of this factory Asia case, which is this is a case with 12 countries and 12 stages. So it says the best way to produce this would be you'd start in the US, you go to Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, then Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and China. Okay, so why? Well, that's what, given the estimates of tau, that's the optimal way to do it. Why is assembly in China? Well, it's probably here rather than here. But why is assembly in China? Well, because China is a very central location. Why is China central? To a large extent because it's close to China, but also because it's close to just about any other country in factory Asia. So the value chain would have this pure snake feature, and then from China, obviously, the output is shipped everywhere. Okay?
From your model, or?
Yes.
Interesting.
So that's the model-based. So you can think about this as being our model-based measure of remoteness, centrality, the object that you would want to minimize. And if that's what you want to minimize and allocate countries based on that, that's what you would find. Okay. Now, obviously, there's no value chain that looks like this. Okay. But we have one good, so we have to obviously it has to flow through all the countries, and we're kind of forcing this. Despite sort of very stylized, I mean, it's kind of interesting that if you look at the upstreamness in this optimal global value chain, and you compare it to this average measures coming from the trade data, and there's measures of upstreamness that Russ and David and Thibault and I have developed, this is a very clear correlation. Okay, so you don't need to kind of come up with other stories for why Indonesia or Philippines are upstream. That the model is telling you that that's what you should see. Okay, so I'm not doing too good on time. Let me give you a flavor of the non-injective case, which is the case in which we're not forcing a country to just produce one stage. This is very costly. It's not going to be optimal. It doesn't make any sense to have the same number of stages in China than in Singapore. Okay, we're forcing that to be the case, but if there's agglomeration economies, you'd expect that there's no reason why you would want to do that. But that's a much trickier case to look at. Okay, so to begin, what we're looking at is within this sort of more complicated case, we're still going to restrict the case to one homogeneous good. There's J countries and N stages where, crucially, we now allow J to be different than N. And then we're still going to restrict the case in which each country is getting the final good from only one chain, and that chain is a pure snake. Okay? But now, notice that there could be various value chains. Countries could produce in different stages in distinct value chains. You could be in autarky. I mean, we're now looking at what's actually optimal. Okay? So in terms of the math, I'll skip this, but basically it's much more complicated to a large extent because of those nonlinearities that are coming from the allocation of labor to different stages. So maybe that's the answer to Russ' questions before. But it becomes much trickier to kind of look at that. But the insights that we're trying to kind of find some sort of propositions that kind of capture that is that intuitive, you'd think that as trade costs fall or agglomeration economies increase, you'd expect value chains to become more and more global. Okay, so we're trying to kind of find ways to formalize that, but we're not quite there. Computationally, you can still use LP techniques to kind of reduce the dimensionality of the problem, although if we want to kind of look at the world through the length of this, we're eventually going to probably have to kind of do something with country size and sort of have groups of countries, like 5 groups of countries or something like that, because otherwise you get into a highly dimensional problem. Just to give you a sense of what happens in this very simple, the same case as before, so same J as N, but we're no longer forcing a stage to just a unique value chain that flows through all countries. What we find here, and this is this takes a while to run, I guess, I don't know exactly, but what you find is that what I showed you before is not optimal. There's actually 3 value chains. There's a single final good in the world economy, but you wouldn't want to have just this massive value chain. You'd have 3 different ones, one of them ending in China, but another one ending in South Korea, and another one ending in Singapore. And then from this value chains, the model is also telling you who's consuming the output of these value chains. Okay, so there's a production, and then the consumption. Okay, and what we want to do this is sort of use this and sort of expand it outside of Asia to think about global value chains in the world economy, what's sort of the optimal organization of those, and then trying to perhaps calibrate the model in a way that matches some aspects of the data and do counterfactuals. Now, we haven't done that here, but we can still do a counterfactual, which is you take this and we can reduce trade frictions relative to the ones we back out from the data, and we find sort of consolidation of value chains. We have 3 value chains here. You can easily kind of reduce it to 2, okay, which look kind of crazy because we're going to free trade, I think, here. But basically, this idea of reduction of trade frictions, basically connecting countries that were not connected before, and reducing the amount of value chains is something that we should see more broadly. Obviously, if we jacked up trade frictions to infinity, you'd end up with not 3 value chains, but with 12, because each country would be in order.
This is the part where you say it's related to the proximity concentration trade-off, or not yet? I mean,
yeah, this is all. This
is all about that. No, yeah. It's about the fact that you may want to do FDI instead of exporting, like, or you are basically avoiding the. Is there some fixed cost of a new chain, or like is there no? So
no, it's just.
So you're just split. So this is like I am not sure I understand the 3 chains. So there's assembly in the 3 final spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously, you might be better off having. You'd think, well, you want to concentrate everything, but there's an important aspect in this case which is going to matter worldwide too, which is there's big differences in size of these countries. So the previous arrangement is very costly because you have so we have here these numbers basically tell you the number of stages in each country, which is something we're also solving for. And you kind of want to allow you this flexibility, and that sort of messes up everything. Okay, so this is where we are here. But again, we're not there yet. But what would be interesting, I think, is to use this type of tools to think about this transition from local to then regional to then global value chains, and see do this to kind of look at possible counterfactuals. So if I have a few minutes, I'm not going to go through all the details, but I want to give you a flavor of an alternative approach. And again, I don't know if it's all going to fit together, or we're talking about a different project, but there's another approach with the same problem that you could follow to try to shed light on this set of types of counterfactuals. And that would be by adopting the Eaton and Cordham approach. Again, this would be a good way to go if what you're particularly interested is in using the model to fit specific global value chains in specific sectors. But if you just want to get a sense of, on average, where in value chains countries are and how do policies affect the average position of countries in value chains, this might be a more fruitful approach. Okay, and past work on multi-stage EK models has focused on low-dimensional environments, I think in part because of reasons that I'm going to try to illustrate, which is that the EK approach is not easily extended to more higher dimensional environments. So in terms of the formals, we had before from the beginning preferences defined over a continuum over a bunch of goods. So that's what we're going to have. We're going to impose this CS structure as in Eaton and Cordham. The technology is Cobb-Douglas as before, but notice I've now gotten rid of the agglomeration economy. Why? Because we don't need it. Now we're going to have Ricardian differences. There's going to be some incentives to break up value chains from that Ricardian perspective. Okay, so that's completely standard Ricardian model. And what's new is that this unit labor requirements for goods Z, stage N, and country J are drawn from this Frichet distribution. So we're going to make this standard assumptions in Eaton and Cordham. What's the problem here? Even in the n equal to 2 case, you might say, okay, just apply the Eaton and Cordham tricks. The problem is that when you're trying to figure out the optimal allocation of stages in a value chain across countries, you would want to minimize this cost function, which is a function of obviously the draws at different stages in the value chain. And what's nice about Eaton and Cordham is that with the Frichet assumption, the distribution of the minimum cost is well defined, it's beautiful, you can get all this juice out of it, but the product of 2 Frichet distributions is not Frichet. The sum of 2 Frichet distributions is not Frichet. There's not an obvious cost function you can feed into the model such that the overall cost function has nice properties. Okay, and that's why, I guess you can go to the computer and do a bunch of things, but as you scale up production, you move more and more stages, it's only going to get uglier and uglier. So what do we propose? And I'd be curious to see whether you think it's crazy or not. I don't think it's entirely crazy. Is the following. So EK assume that firms, the analogous to EK here would assume that firms know exactly the productivity levels in a value chain for all stages in all countries before they make any location decisions. Okay, so they basically look at all these draws and they decide the lowest cost location. Suppose instead that firms learn their particular realization of the productivity of a supplier in a given location or a given stage only when the location of the previous stage has been decided. Okay, so you can start from, you can actually do it backwards or forward. It's going to work either way. You can imagine I first decide where I get the raw materials, and then I'm going to see how good the raw materials are, and then I'm going to go to the next stage, and then I'm going to look at the stage up to n-1, and I decide where I go next. Or you could say, first I'm going to decide where I'm going to assemble, and then once I know where I'm going to assemble, where I found a good supplier, I'm going to look at the productivity of guys right before me. Okay? So if you make this assumption that this process is sequential, then basically you recover the Eaton and Cordham magic. Why? Because in the two-stage case, when you're minimizing the location of the second stage, you're taking, when you do this sort of forward iteration, the cost of the previous stage, you take it as given. So you're doing only the, you're doing Eaton and Cordham, if you want, only with respect to the second stage. And by the sequentiality, basically, you can show that a lot of the appealing features of that Fréchet distribution are going to survive. Okay, so you can do this for n equal to 2, 3, 4, whatever you want. Essentially, what you get out of that is a formula for the likelihood that any of these multiple value chains in the world economy is going to flow through a sequence of countries. So can you tell me, out of all the potential global value chains that we see in the world economy, what share of them are value chains in which the end stages are done in the US, or in which the first stage is done in the US, the second stage in China, third stage wherever you want? You can, obviously, there's going to be millions and millions of possibilities. This is a formula that tells you, just give me some basic primitives of the model, the matrix of trade costs, and these A's, which are basically this standard terms in Eaton and Cordham, and I'm going to tell you what shares are going to come out of this. Okay? So what's interesting, I think, is that if you look at this formula, there's actually a very close connection to what we had before. So the same centrality-downstreamness nexus that we had before is going to come out here. You have the same sum of log costs with the same exponents. There's other bells and whistles, obviously, but we're kind of closing the circle. And this is maybe a too complicated a world where everybody is participating with everybody at different stages and different value chains.
Paul.
Yes.
Isn't WJ endogenous? WJ endogenous or exogenous?
So
I think that was kind of wage rate.
Yeah. So we're not closing the model here. I'm not going to have time, I guess, but when we calibrate the model, we're going to calibrate the whole thing. So obviously for counterfactuals, it's a little tricky. You want to make sure you close the model but we're not doing counterfactuals yet. What I'll emphasize is that this, as in Eaton and Cordham, you can turn these probabilities into sort of market share. So our sense is that you can use world input-output tables and actually use those to exactly calibrate these moments, so that we know, there's a lot of techniques that have been used for doing counterfactual analysis in those cases. Okay, so my point here is that even if we've complicated the model greatly, I mean, it's much more rich what comes out of the model, we're going to get proposition 1, although it's a sort of a variant of that proposition. So let me quickly walk you through it. So the way that we're going to do that analog is we basically take this probabilities coming out of the model and use them to compute what we call the average upstreamness of production of a given country in value chains that seek to serve consumers in any country I. Okay, so tell me a destination. I'm going to tell you where in the value chain that services those consumers are countries on average. Okay, and it's going to turn out to be a very simple formula of these probabilities. And there's a close connection with the upstreamness measure that we've worked with Russ and David and Thibault. It's essentially the same idea, where you're looking at the average position of a sector in the value chain. Here's the average position of a country. So you can map it to the measures that we produced in our paper. And the result is that if you adopt, again, the very simple log-separable trade cost specification, the average upstreamness of a country is going to be decreasing in its centrality. Okay, so you can sort of show that analytically. You can also go to the data set, trade costs are not log-separable. Okay, and this is sort of the evidence that I showed you before. This is in line with the evidence, but notice that what I have here is actually in line with what comes out of the model. And then if you go to the data, you can also do compare the data to the model, and we don't get a perfect fit, but it's sort of highly correlated. The upstreamness that comes out of this relative to the other. So Paula's making all sorts of signs, so I'll just stop here and take any questions, or we can go for lunch.
A couple, quick. Yeah, Glenn?
A question about the estimation of the likelihood. So it looks a little bit like an MCMC problem. Don't you have similar problems trying to identify the probability there? Because the probability space is so huge.
Where?
2 slides back. Yeah, there.
So this?
Yes. Yeah.
So there's no estimation here. All we're doing is we are getting proxies of this, which you can show. This is essentially related to the fixed for the U.S. case, and so there's a big assumption for the U.S. case. You can map this to what Teresa, Felix, and I estimated, and then we use the same matrix of trade costs. And there's no estimation. It's just sort of feeding those numbers, and then computing these probabilities and computing this object based on the probabilities, and comparing it to what we see. Down the line, if you want to do this more structurally, there's a lot of problems of estimation, but we're hoping you can use Deckel et al. There's a bunch of techniques that have been used to be able to do counterfactuals without having to estimate all the parameters of the model. So we're hoping that we can use world input-output tables to get the right moments to do this type of exercises.
Can you go back to your last slide? So in terms of the man-made, so if you could, suppose they are man-made, if you're wouldn't your model suggest that, so if, all these developing countries sort of come into Darius and they all want to go downstream, they don't like to be upstream where there's little value, they all want to move up the value chain. So I guess trade liberalization, so to the extent that the TAUs are endogenous and you are far away, you're remote.
Look, I don't know. I'm not so sure what countries. I mean, you also hear countries that are doing assembly and they want to move up the value chain. So it's a little.
So it's not obvious that you would want to reduce to them, if you are.
My own view is I mean, it's not even clear when they say moving up the value chain. Is it really in a sequential sense or it's a value-added sense? Mm-hmm. So, but I think that's part of the issue here. That so we're using all these terms, and at least coming from where I come from, it's a little bit hard to kind of know exactly what we mean in terms of a model. So what the hope here is that in the same manner that we're showing that movements in trade frictions lead to very perhaps nonlinear responses of how stuff gets organized, that we can use that to see how tariffs affect things or other types of trade frictions, and then to do some sort of normative analysis of what's good and what's bad. So that's where we are hoping to head at some point, but we're not there.
Kalina, you had a question? No? Very good. So let's go for lunch. Thanks a lot.